Alrighty. Okay, let's start here. Okay. So last class we were talking about socialization, which we're going to continue today. All right. First thing though. So, except if you got a deferral from me for some reason, your midterm 1 grade should be up. If you want to come and take a look at your midterm, right? So you want to check it over. I don't release them freely on eClass, but you can come in and I'll hand you an iPad and you can take a look at your exam. I'll be in the office tomorrow. Okay, I'll try not to cancel this. I might have to. My 4-year-old is a little bit under the weather. So if I have to stay home with him, I might have to just cancel last minute. But I should be in the office starting at 9:30 tomorrow morning until about 3:30 in the afternoon. But I will send just a quick email out today to let you know. So if you want to come in and take a look, you'll be more than free to do so. And like I said, I'll be around pretty much all day tomorrow. I only have 2 tablets, so maybe 3. I might have a 3rd one in my office, which belongs to the CCR. So if you come in, you might have to be just a touch patient with me to take a look at it, but you're more than welcome to come in anytime tomorrow and take a look if you're interested in seeing your midterm. Okay, so last time we ended off on this slide, right? We were talking about socialization and how socialization shapes us, and specifically, right, the big point that your life, who you are, is shaped particularly through the slice of history you happen to live through. Okay, the stream is up. The stream is up. It is up. I put it up as quickly as I could. It is in fact up. Okay, so one example of this principle, right, that the slice of history that you happen to live in ultimately shapes your experience of life, is this particular idea, right? So the idea of childhood, adolescence, and youth. There's a lot of good historical arguments that the way that we think about children is probably only about 200 years old, right? That basically it emerges sometime in the 19th century. It had been developing maybe since the middle part of the 15th century with the invention of the printing press. And this whole book, The Disappearance of Childhood by Neil Postman, is all about, how childhood came to be and why he thinks it's disappearing. Really interesting book, and I talk about it a lot in my class on the sociology of youth. But basically, a lot of history has said that children really, in the way we think of them, people who have this delayed period of innocence where they don't have to be part of the overall economic system of the world, right, is a relatively recent invention. It comes, really from the invention of the printing press and then the requirement to have lots of skills to work in the economy that came from the Industrial Revolution, right? In pre-industrial societies, right, Postman makes this claim, as do lots of others. Basically, children were considered small adults, right? They were put to work from about age 6 going forward, right, when they could do some physical tasks, right, usually on a family farm, but sometimes sent away to apprentice, to be a cobbler or a blacksmith or a tanner or a baker or a miller or something like this. And that is the entire list of medieval professions that I know. It emerges when it does, right, in the terms that we have, because of specific social need and specific technological inputs, right? The printing press and industrial production being the big one. Adolescence comes even later. We don't get anyone talking about adolescence until at least the 19th century, at which point G. Stanley Hall starts to talk about it, and you start to get teenagers treated as a distinct category. And just for, I don't know if it's interesting to you or not, the word teenager doesn't exist in the English language until it's used for the first time by the New York Times Oops, that should be a 9. In 1957, right? So there is no word teenager in English until 1957. That's how recent a concept it is, right? You're probably like, that's really old. And I'm like, well, my dad was like 10 years old at that point, so it seems less old for me. Okay. So one of the ways we typically discuss, how these slices of life, right, how these particular moments in history, especially how particular moments in in history shape the people who live through them, is by talking about different kinds of categories. Sometimes you'll talk about an age cohort, right? Category of people born in the same years, right? In the same range of years, right? So you might talk about people born between 2000 and 2010. Age roles, right? The norms and expectations and behaviors of people in different age cohorts. But the more typical one is generational cohorts, right? We now talk about generational cohorts a lot. I've referred to Gen Z and millennials and things a lot in this course, and I do a lot. And there's a really fascinating book called Generations out by Jean Twenge, which just came out last year, which really deep dives into how different generations experience life. Okay, so the generational cohorts that we typically talk about when we talk about Canadian or American society are as follows, right? So the greatest generation, those born between 1901 and 1928. So why do we talk about generational cohorts? Maybe I'll say a word about that. Did I have it on the last slide? I'll go back. Yeah, generally we talk about them because they're people who grew up in particular historical periods where there were events that were particularly shaping their identities, right? So they all grew up with similar kind of inputs, and they developed similar identities as a generation because of it. Okay, the first of these, and these folks are almost all past now, right? Because the oldest of them would be, just shy of, or the youngest of them would be just shy of 100 years old, right? So there's not very many of the greatest generation around. But they were around for the bulk of the 20th century, right? And these were, the people who came of age, right? So they became adults during the Great Depression, and typically they were the ones who fought during the Second World War, right? From 1939 till 1945. And that was, the Depression and the war were the things that shaped the greatest generation in really, really strong ways, right? So they tended to be a very resilient generation, one that was very committed to things like national service, and they also tended to be extremely frugal, because they started their adult lives during the Great Depression. The silent generation, sometimes kind of a weirdly overlooked generation, but one that was super influential, and actually the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, is the first and only president from the silent generation, which is kind of a weird piece of trivia, and probably the last. He's not looking too good. So the silent generation was the generation basically that mostly came of age during they were sort of too young to go fight in the Second World War, and they became adults mostly right after the Second World War. So, sometimes known as the lucky generation for that reason, because they didn't have to fight in the Second World War, and they also enjoyed a period of enormous economic success, right? Because after the Second World War, the economy went super, super well, and for about 3 decades. So they lived through, 30 years of their working lives in an economy that was very hot, and they did super well. They got very, very wealthy. Lots of things that are interesting about them, right? They were the first generation to grow up with radio, right? With the radio as a kind of central medium of their lives. They're the first generation to experience television in the home, right? They were already adults by the time it starts to come in, but they're the first generation to have it. And, basically shaped Canadian and American society in really substantial ways. They were, for example, the generation that was most responsible for the civil rights movement, for at least the beginning part of the women's liberation or feminist movements, and the gay rights movement all kind of emerged from the silent generation, though we tend to think of them as quite traditional because they got married really young and had a lot of children. They'll have more children than any generation after them, right? I don't know how much you care, but I'll tell you, on average, at their peak, they were having 3.8 children per woman. If you want to know what it is today, if you talk about millennials, you're talking about 1.2. 1.2 children per woman. So they had a lot of kids, right? They got married very early. What was it that because I was reading Twenge's book about the generations. In the 1950s, half of new brides were teenagers, right? So they were mostly 18 and 19, but with some 16 and 17-year-olds mixed in there as well. So a lot of getting married very young and having lots and lots of kids. All right, the next generation after that, this is probably one of the most influential generations because they were a huge one. So the baby boomers, so-called because they were the children born from this, the greatest generation and the silent generation after the war. So between this period, right, of roughly 1946 to 1965, in the United States, 78 million babies were born in the United States between 1946 and 1965, which, just as a reference point, is more than the current population of France. So it was an enormous kind of generational cohort, never seen before, never seen again, and I mean benefited from the fact that really low infant mortality. So most of them survived into adulthood, which is now causing us a bunch of problems because they're all getting old and they need healthcare. In Canada, if you're curious, it was 8.6 million babies born in Canada from a total population before the war of about 12.2 million. So after the baby boom, you've got somewhere in the range of about, a little bit more than 20 million people, whereas before you had 12, right? It's this enormous demographic cohort. And that's principally their influence is they've dominated cultural life ever since, and the things they cared about were things that, we all end up caring about. They carried on the traditions. So they're the first generation raised with television as part of their everyday life, right? Because they mostly they're mostly becoming kind of mid-childhood when television is first introduced in the home in the 1950s, and the later boomers will experience television through their whole lives. They also, have a bunch of things that they fight. Again, things like the Vietnam War. This is the anti-Vietnam War generation. It's also the generation in Canada that experienced what's called Trudeau-mania, right? Not for the current Trudeau, he wasn't born yet, but for his father, right? And the huge cultural influence of Pierre Elliott Trudeau and all he brought to Canada. They're the ones that celebrated Canada's 100 years, right? The centenary in 1967. And, the popular music of the period, their tastes ultimately shaped the music industry and the film industry for decades to come, even though all the members of the Beatles were of the silent generation, and so were most of the Rolling Stones and a lot of the big artists of the period. All right, Generation X. It depends on who you ask. Some people put, Gen X as ending in 1979 or 1980. My sister continues to insist that it has to end in 1980 because that's the year she was born and she doesn't want to be considered a millennial. So, Generation X, basically the generation born after the boomers, they come of age in the 1980s principally, right? They become adults principally in the 1980s. And basically they face a much worse kind of outcome. They're seen as a very cynical generation, a very hopeless generation. They face a bunch of economic kind of malaise because the economy goes bad just as they're sort of starting to come into the job market. And they're faced with, the baby boomers taking up all the good jobs and not wanting to ever move on. They're also the first generation really shaped by cable television and fragmentation of kind of technology, right? Where suddenly everybody can watch whatever show they want and all of that fun stuff. And then, the last generation is on my slide. I'll tell you about Gen Z in a sec. Millennials, maybe depends on who you ask. Could be as early as 1980, no later than 1982 when it starts, to the early 2000s. Usually people put the end of millennials at about 2005. Millennials, right? This is the first generation to experience to come of age in the 21st century, right? So the oldest of the millennials were either between 18 and 20 when we hit the year 2000. It was really cool. They shot like spiral fireworks off the Eiffel Tower. It was awesome. The world did not melt down because everybody thought that every computer would shut down in the year 2000 because of the Y2K bug. It was kind of scary, but super fun. They also, are the first generation to experience the internet as part of their daily lives. The internet, basically becomes a feature of everyday life and commercially available around 1995 when people can get it at home. And from then, millennials have the internet all the time, right? But they still experienced a childhood before the internet. So they still remember what it was like, before you had internet of any kind. As of 2016, they are the biggest living generation as the baby boomers start to die off a little bit. And they're both more ethnically and racially diverse than any previous generation and the most educated generation in history. I'll leave that there. Pick it up later. I like to fiddle with things. It's a curse. Okay, they're followed by, obviously, and I don't have it on the slides, Gen Z. Gen Z also sometimes, that's most of y'all. Anyone born after 2005 is Gen Z. Roughly 2000, early 2000s, 2005, 2002, depends on who you ask. I guess some of you are still a little bit older than that, so you'd be very, very, very young millennials. But mostly, the people coming in are now Gen Z. Excuse me. Gen Z is sometimes referred to as the anxious generation. Gen Z is also the first generation to grow up with smartphones, which came, into everyday life in about 2007 when Jobs introduces the iPhone. Steve Jobs at Apple introduces the iPhone. And it's a generation, you can come take sociology of youth with me and I'll depress you to hell and back about Gen Z because it's a very depressed, very anxious generation in general, probably driven by social media. Okay, I need a question slide here. So, sometimes, this is what the textbook said. I've seen other people put, the millennials as ending, and this is probably more correct, about 1998. The textbook says, early 2000s. I think Twenge, if I remember, I should look it up in her book. I think she puts it at 1998. So none of you would all be Gen Z. Trust me, millennials are awesome, though. You better say so, or I'll curse you forever. Yeah, definitely not millennials. What's wrong with being a millennial? I'll wait. No, I'm kidding. The younger Gen Z scare you? Oh, trust me, everything scares me. Oh, I guess my daughter, born in 2010. So my daughter and son have this ongoing fight. My son wants to be Gen Z. He's born in 2012, and my daughter insists that Gen Z ends in 2010 and that he's a Gen Alpha or Gen Polar. And I'm like, guys, this is a stupid fight. Gen Z, maybe, late 90s, I think probably fits better. No, I won't test you on Gen Z. I don't have any questions on Gen Z. I just say it for interest. Okay, early 2000s. Sometimes, do you need to know the year? No, just know kind of general outline. Okay, I won't test you on Gen Z. You could be millennials. Oh, that's an interesting question. Guys, y'all are so mean. Millennials aren't that bad. Trust me, one of them controls your grades. Not to put too fine a point on it, but you all failed the second midterm. Okay. Sorry. I will answer this last question after I answer this one. I will be here on Friday afternoon after this class. However, I'm not sure. Everything's going kind of squirrely. My wife is sick. My kid is sick. And so if I get sick, then you don't want to be around me. But probably on Friday afternoon after this class, yes. Okay, do the names of Gen X and Gen Z have any correlation to each other? They do. They do, because people are super uncreative, and that's the reason, right? So Generation X, the reason they were named Gen X, right, is a little bit lost, but mostly has to do with the fact that, X is kind of a negative letter, and they were kind of a negative generation and fairly cynical. And then millennials initially were called Gen Y, right? But millennials sort of renamed themselves to millennial because Gen Y was a really crappy name. And then for some reason, people started calling the generation after Gen Y, which was no longer called Gen Y, Gen Z. And it seems to have sort of stuck. I don't know why. I don't like it. I prefer either Zoomer, which I think is better. But you know what? Well, yeah, you guys kind of get stuck with stuff. Don't worry, the next one is even worse. It's like Generation Alpha, because like we go back to the beginning, and I guess maybe we're going to start with Greek letters now. So Z is not the worst. All right, let's move on. Okay. Chatter, chatter, chatter. Okay. Okay, functionalists, right? What do functionalists kind of think about socialization, right? Functionalists will tend to emphasize the fact that socialization is there to maintain basic social relations, right? And keep orderly patterns of social relations. That basically, the way that we're socialized shapes our values and gives us common values, especially, that help us get along with people in society, right? So it's all about the transmission of culture and the transmission of values. Okay, conflict theorists and feminists tend to stress, that socialization kind of enshrines things like class and gender-based divisions and oppression, right? That basically, and this is especially true, say, of feminists, right? They'll say that the patriarchy is reproduced through socialization, right? And I showed you that video from the BBC, right? That we basically re-enshrine patriarchy through, passing it on through socialization. Basically, it's a way of reproducing conflicts and reproducing forms of oppression. And symbolic interactionists, right, because they're funky and weird and super fun, they highlight how basically people can transcend their socialization and actually take how they were socialized, because they're definitely shaped by society, but then also reinterpret the norms of society to reshape it. Okay. So where do we get socialization? So when we talk about primary socialization, right, the agent of the first socialization you get, or primary socialization, and where you're going to get most of it, is from the family, right? Because you're going to spend the most time with your family, and with few exceptions, your family are the most important relationships that you have, because they're the most enduring ones, right? You can change your friends, and you will, but you can't change your parents, even if you want to, or your siblings, right? So they are an enduring part of your socialization, right? And how you're shaped in childhood will affect a lot of the things that you do in adulthood, and it's going to take years of therapy for you to fix that. Okay, and yeah, the family you're born into exerts an enduring influence, right? The values of your family will shape you. Trust me, I'm in my 40s, and I swore I would never turn into my dad, and I'm 100% turning into my dad. It's terrible. Someone shoot me. Please. I want to turn into my dad. He's a lovely man. And yet, no. And yet, I can't help it, right? And my wife is 100% turning into her mother. Okay. My mother-in-law is lovely. I just wouldn't want to marry her. Okay. Bad jokes. All right, school and peers, right? So, school and peers are generally, and especially the peers that you have at school, are generally seen as the most important locus of what's called secondary socialization, right? So this is what happens outside the home, and other agents of socializing you shaping your values. School is probably the most important because on average, right, and I'm sorry to say this, when we think about it, you're probably going to spend a solid 17 or more years of your life in some kind of schooling, right? If you throw kindergarten in there and then you throw in your undergrad, that's 13 plus 4, that's 17 years. Sad. If you have preschool, right, you can throw in 18 years. If you do a master's, 20. If you do a PhD, maybe 26, right? So that's a lot of years in school. So it's a very powerful source of socialization. The hidden curriculum in schools, right? So this has been argued by people like Pierre Bourdieu, that basically school, in terms of having its actual curriculum, right, which is your reading, your writing, and your math, and your sciences, and all of that fun stuff, school also has what they call a hidden curriculum. And especially, what does the hidden curriculum do, right? It teaches obedience to authority and conformity to cultural norms, specifically aimed at making you two things: a good worker who can follow your boss's orders, and a good citizen who values the same things as your country, right? So, basically shapes people along normative values. Some arguments, especially from critical race and feminist scholars, have suggested that the hidden curriculum ends up being a problem, especially for students of racial minority families who reject the hidden curriculum. Especially often what they would suggest is the inherent whiteness of a lot of the things that are taught in schools, right? Particularly around social norms, linguistic norms, and literature and other cultural tastes. Reject them, often putting them at odds with the school system, meaning they do somewhat poorly. Questions? Did I skip? Which slide did I skip? I did skip a slide. I'm sorry. I've now gone back. I got hung up with this. Okay, I will do that now. The education, yes, it would be good if the whispering stopped. I can hear it up here too. The education system feels kind of like a prison. I sentence you to a master's degree for that comment. Can I define the patriarchy? The patriarchy is a system of values and norms that favors maleness and men at the expense of women, and particularly is defined to both control women and especially control their sexuality in a feminist sort of definition. Okay, where did Gen Alpha come from then? So when a mommy and a daddy love each other very that's a terrible joke, and I went there 100%, just committed to it. So basically, this is the generation sort of post 2012, right? So anyone born 2012 is Gen Alpha, so 2013 forward, right? I'm sorry for the mommy-daddy joke, the birds and the bees thing. Okay, I missed a slide. How does socialization work? I'll go back and then I'll talk about other things again. Basically humans are surrounded by things in the cultural environment, right? Parents, friends, media, television, anything you can imagine, right? Any kind of cultural influence basically shapes them, right? It tells you what's important and tells you what's good and bad. Apparently screaming at your football coach like a maniac, not good, and gets you scorn and mockery. Although the internet Twitter has been hilarious. I didn't even watch the Super Bowl, and yet Travis Kelce, losing hit on his coach is burned into my mind. And obviously it's oh, he shouldn't have done that, right? But, everything in the social environment, whether it's, direct influences by people, parents, friends, teachers, shapes us, as do things like the media. Adaptation, right? How does it work? Basically, as you kind of work through life, you're adapting to your environment, right? You get messages, you do things trying to gain the cooperation of the environment, right? You want teachers to write you a letter of recommendation. You want friends. You adapt your behavior to get those things at the end of the day. Yeah, and it's, fundamentally kind of an evolutionary process. It evolves as we go forward in life, right? You do things, in any environment, you act on the basis of what you are at that time. The environment responds, right? You're in kindergarten and you're gregarious and you just sort of, start talking to people all the time, and your teacher's like, shh, be quiet. That's my kids. They were always talkers. Be quiet, you have to listen now. And then you adapt your behavior, right? You learn how to be in that environment. And you're kind of doing this through your entire life, right? As you go into the workforce, you learn how to behave. As you get old, you learn how to, as you have children, you learn how to be a parent. All of these things, all through socialization. I haven't seen the Barbie movie, but apparently someone in the Barbie movie thinks the patriarchy is a horse. I don't know. I should probably watch it. It's on my to-do list. Okay, hang on. Did I get through everything that was on this slide? I did. Okay, I did. Okay, so symbolic interactionists, right? When it comes to questions of socialization and how how your actions can ultimately affect the way people behave and the environment, right? So there's a couple of ideas, right? And you should treat them, I know they're similar, but you should treat them as distinct categories, right? Because they're not quite the same, right? Okay, so things like the Thomas theorem, right? So the Thomas theorem is basically this idea that in the world, I can't see the time. I still can't see the time. Nope. All right, that didn't work. Okay, 35, I'm doing good. Basically, the Thomas theorem is the idea that situations we treat as real ultimately will become real in their consequences, right? So somehow our behavior actually shapes the social world, right? So one of the examples of something that we could call in the Thomas theorem is the idea of nation states, right? So really, obviously, if you look at a map, at the globe, you go into space and you look at the globe, there are no borders on Earth, right? It just doesn't exist. They're human creations. However, in treating national borders and national identities as though they are real things, we sort of bring them into existence, right? We treat people like there's a difference between someone living in El Paso, Texas, that person is an American, and someone living in, I don't know, Tijuana. Is it Tijuana on the other side of the border from El Paso? I think that's right. And that person is Mexican, right? And that those differences are meaningful. And by doing that, we sort of create that difference as meaningful, right? Same thing, like if you drive down to Coots, Alberta, right? Wow, that was loud. On one side of the border, you're Canadian. On the other side, you go into Sweetgrass, Montana, you're American. We treat those things as meaningful differences, and we make them real as a result of how we act, right? That's the idea of the Thomas theorem. We bring reality to bear by things like socialization. We socialize people on this side of the border as Canadian, on that side of the border as American, and we create that difference through our actions. Okay, Thomas theorem generally on a grander scale. Self-fulfilling prophecy is a little bit different. So, a self-fulfilling prophecy, and especially when agents of socialization, will kind of make a proclamation about something that's going to happen, they can bring that to fruition. So, for example, if I tell all of you that the second midterm is extremely hard, it's not. It's about the same. Don't worry. Just an example. And that you are going to have to study in order to do really well. One of the things that's probably going to happen is you're all going to study a lot harder, right? And then you're all going to do really well. Why? Because I essentially created a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I'm like, it's really hard, but if you study a lot, right, you're going to do really well. You bring that about, my prophecy that you need to study really hard will bring that result about. Because you're going to be like, man, he said it's going to be hard. I better study really hard. Conversely, right, if a teacher says to a student, you're really stupid. Hopefully no teachers exist that would ever say that to a student. But you're really stupid. You're never going to succeed at anything, right? A kid might take that into their own kind of thinking and be like, I'm really stupid. I can never accomplish anything. And then they never try in school. And it's actually the prediction by the socializing agent that brings that about. Self-fulfilling that's loud. Sorry, I talked too loud. Self-fulfilling prophecies can also be things that you do personally to yourself, right? If you're like, man, I'm so bad at math, I can't pass this math test, and so on the night before your math test, instead of studying, you play all night playing Fortnite or something. I don't know what people play anymore. Fortnite or Minecraft or Call of Duty or whatever, and then you fail the test, you're like, see, I really am too dumb to pass this math test. But you actually brought about the result that you predicted that you're going to fail the math test by not studying, right? If you'd studied, you might very well have passed. So that's the idea behind a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, all right. Other agents of socialization, peer groups, your friends and enemies, but mostly your friends. Friends tend to become a really important agent of socialization kind of in late childhood, early adolescence, when people start to separate from their parents and care more what their friends think of them than what their parents think of them, right? And peer groups there can, generally shift values and norms and understandings that people have in significant ways. Younger kids, right? Early elementary, peers still influence. They're not as influential. They become really influential in adolescence, right? And peer groups, what is a peer group? People who are roughly the same age and of a similar status as you as an individual, right? So that is your peer group. So your friends in high school probably resembled you a lot in terms of things like socioeconomic status, religion, race and ethnicity less so now, especially with Gen Z, which is much more diverse. But it used to be that peer groups were typically pretty homogenous in terms of race and ethnicity. And one of the things that we know, especially with adolescents, is that status is very, very important to adolescents. And so in kind of adolescence, people will seek the approval of their peers in major ways, right? And whether, this is one of the myths that adolescents or teenagers are super rebellious. They're actually unbelievably conformist because they're all pretty concerned about status and maintaining their status within whatever peer groups they have. Okay. No questions. Perfect. 41. All right. The media. Oh, the media, and especially the mass media, right? So mass media, generally we talk about things like, anything that's sent from a central source out to many people. These are my people. I'm not going to draw legs on everyone. It'll take too long. Right, but from a central point with few people to many people, right? So we talk about things like broadcasting out to people because you're sending a message broadly out, right? So mass media, really has been an important source of socialization probably since really the beginning of the newspaper being the central medium of communication in the 19th century, and has only gotten more influential as it's become more pervasive, right? So, newspapers were pretty pervasive. Television, when we bring, films are pretty pervasive too. They're a major kind of source of values and socialization. But once things like radio move into people's homes, television moves into people's homes, and then you get, more and more proliferation of these things. And of course, ending in the black rectangle that you carry around in your pocket that holds all of your tastes, right? And can be used to reach you at any particular moment. We get more and more kind of mass media hitting people all the time, right? So it includes things like, radio, movies, videos, CDs, they do not exist anymore. Audio tapes, yeah, still kind of a thing, maybe, in like developing countries. The internet is the big one now, and the internet is funny because it is sort of the medium of mediums, right? The internet is every medium rolled into one. It's newspapers, magazines, books, music, radio, all that stuff. Television now all become one medium. Mass media today, probably the most influential one. My pen died. I'm sure you're all sad. But I didn't draw that. I don't know. Sad. All right. That's just slow. Okay, never mind. I like my pen. I do. It's become more pervasive, and obviously, right, we understand the role that the internet as a mass media plays in shaping people's norms and values, because we call the people, who are on the internet and shape people's norms and values influencers. So we've obviously sort of understood what they're doing. And most of them are, I've realized now that I'm getting old, and most of them kind of horrify me, so we've reached late stage Jeff, I guess. Okay, mass media and the feminist approach. So obviously all of these theories have their own way of seeing mass media, right? And if we get to mass media at the end of the course, we'll talk about it. For instance, functionalists tend to view it as a good way of passing on values. Conflict theorists look at it as a way of indoctrinating the next generation in the values of capitalism. Interactionists are like, oh, it gives people so many choices how to build their identities. Feminists, in that kind of conflict theory vein, tend to view mass media as a way of influencing people and shaping their ideas, particularly around values, behaviors, and things like gender, right? And so that's why, especially in recent years, you've had such concerted pushes by the media for more inclusion and representation of say, women, right? For all of its criticisms, right, say the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU, if you didn't know, has put a lot of female heroes in different roles, right? Captain Marvel, I don't know, whoever was in Wakanda Forever, I don't remember anymore. Specifically because the idea from kind of a feminist critique is that you need more women in prominent roles so that women aren't always seeing themselves as these submissive kind of beauties in movies, right? The big critique of the James Bond movies, going back to the 60s from feminists, was that all you got from, say, the James Bond movies was always just a damsel in distress, right? And a super attractive woman who was a damsel in distress who had to be saved by the big, strong hero. And those women basically were eye candy that had no agency of their own. They were just there for James Bond to leer at and have sex with and save, right? And feminists have said, this is a very negative representation for women because it makes them feel like they are just passive agents. So we need better female role models in film and media to combat that, right? So, yeah, and so basically the media will impose, it doesn't, there it is, widely shared expectations about how males and females are supposed to act and interact with each other. And for feminists, right, if this is always one that prizes male agency over female agency, it's one that teaches women that they should be subservient. Oh, I don't think I can finish all of these. Let me do this one, and I'll let you go after this slide. Resocialization, right? So there are occurrences that happen occasionally where people's socialization can basically be overridden, right? And we call this a process of resocialization. So the most typical kind of instances where this happens is where someone is completely removed from a previous kind of social environment and placed in a new one, especially one that is profoundly controlled by particular agents, right? So sometimes we would think of these as prisons. The other one that you might think of is cults, right? Prisons and cults are powerful agents of resocialization. So what typically happens in both scenarios is people cut off from all their other social bonds, have to very quickly adapt and adopt new identities and norms, often against their will, right? Like if you're thrown into prison, you don't want to be there, but in order to survive, you have to often take on a new role in the prison. Okay, we'll leave it there. I could talk about initiation rites. We'll talk about that next time. And we'll keep going. We're almost done socialization, and then we'll jump into deviance and crime, which is always a really fun one. See you on Wednesday or Tuesday. Sleepy. Okay.